Albert Pujols is mentioned as one of the greatest icons in Major League Baseball history, not just because of his rare career longevity, but because of the near-perfect collection of achievements he built over more than 2 decades at the peak. More than 700 home runs, joining the 3,000-hit club, a place reserved only for absolute legends. 3 National League MVP awards, 2 World Series championships, 10 All-Star Game appearances, 6 Silver Sluggers, 2 Gold Gloves, Rookie of the Year, and a long list of seasons with offensive stats ranked among the best in MLB history, all built year after year with an almost unreal consistency, turning Albert Pujols into the ideal model of American baseball. No doping, no scandals, no controversial statements, always leading the clubhouse through actions rather than words. A leader whom coaches trusted, teammates respected, and fans placed absolute faith in, and it was that very string of achievements that framed him in the role of an unallowed-to-fail legend, an icon that sports society is accustomed to viewing with admiration, but rarely questions about the price paid. Because running parallel to that brilliant picture is another life that Pujols was forced to keep hidden, where he had to step onto the field every day with a body full of chronic injuries, enduring prolonged pain in his feet, knees, back, and heels, still smiling and fulfilling his duties, while his willpower had to brace itself to keep from collapsing, where he was both the pillar of his career and the emotional anchor for his family, both the father carrying the responsibility for a disabled child and the man who never allowed himself weakness in his marriage and private life, because just one crack could bring that perfect image crashing down, and so he lived for 20 years in a constant state of tension between pain and discipline, between exhaustion and duty, between the real person behind the closed door and the legend under the lights, until the most terrifying question was no longer how many titles he had won, but what had been eroded inside him over such a long stretch of life, when he was never allowed to fall even once. If you want to continue following the journey behind the spotlight of Albert Pujols, where great feats go hand in hand with pains that were never spoken, please hit subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Albert Pujols' childhood did not begin with pure dreams or carefree afternoons, the way people often imagine when talking about a sports legend, but instead began in poverty, instability, and prolonged fear in the Dominican Republic, where his family's life was tied to cramped houses, scarce meals, and a father who once carried unfinished baseball dreams but was gradually drowned by alcohol, by failure, and by helplessness before life. That man was both the first image of strength that Albert admired and the deepest source of his mental wounds, because when alcohol took over his mind, violence and unpredictable rage became the norm, turning what should have been a safe home into a tense space where a child learned to listen to every footstep, every breath, to know when to stay silent, when to get out of the way. In that atmosphere, Albert had no real childhood. He grew up too soon, learning to observe, endure, and protect himself, while other children were still allowed to be vulnerable and sheltered. The fear did not show through tears but sank deep, quietly shaping a mindset of constant vigilance, always ready to brace for the next crisis. When his family decided to leave the Dominican Republic for the United States, it was not a journey of hope or a romantic rags-to-riches dream, but more like an escape from poverty, from heavy memories, and from an environment that had already inflicted too much damage to stay in. But that journey did not erase what had been etched deep in young Albert's mind. It only carried those scars to a new land where a strange language, an unfamiliar culture, and a growing sense of being out of place made him realize even more that no one could carry that insecurity for him. In America, Albert had to start over, not just learning English or how to fit in, but learning how to stand firm amid differences and expectations. And in that journey, baseball appeared as a rare order amid the chaos. a space with clear rules, where effort was measured by results, and where he could control something in his life. But at the same time, baseball also became the seedbed for a dangerous belief. The belief that only by being strong, only by being better than others, only by never showing weakness would he have the right to exist and be respected. That was not a thirst for glory, but a survival reflex of a child who had witnessed the fragility of adults, who had seen strength vanish because of a single drunken moment or a single failure, and so Albert silently promised himself, though he never said it out loud, that he would never become that person, that he would never let anyone see him fall. That belief, which at first helped him overcome poverty and insecurity, gradually became an invisible burden, because it taught him that emotions were things to hide, that weakness was not permitted, and that responsibility must always come before personal pain. When Albert first stepped onto the baseball field in America, he carried not just a bat and a ball, but an entire past, full of fear, and a silent vow that he would be strong at any cost, that he would control this life with iron discipline, so he would never have to relive the helplessness of his childhood. It was from those early years that the roots of his double life took shape, not as a conscious choice, but as a defense mechanism, where the real person with deep hidden wounds was concealed, giving way to a tough, stable, flawless image. And looking back, people finally understand that the greatest tragedy of Albert Pujols did not begin at the height of fame, but much earlier, right when that little boy came to believe that only strength gave him the right to exist in this world. Baseball came to Albert Pujols not like it did for most other kids, not as an after-school game, not as fun to show off, or a teenage dream cheered by applause, but as the only escape, a narrow door opening in a life forced to grow up way too soon, where young Albert realized that on the field, everything was clearer and fairer than in real life. Either you hit the ball, or you fail. Either you train hard enough, or you get left behind. And in that cold clarity, he found a sense of safety that his childhood had never allowed him to have. Albert's talent didn't explode in a loud way, but quietly and frighteningly, because in a very short time, those around him started to notice that he wasn't just good, he was extraordinarily superior, with a swing that had rare power and precision, game-reading ability far beyond his years, and that very superiority, instead of bringing innocent joy, brought a heavy wave of expectations crashing down on the shoulders of a teenager who hadn't even had time to figure out what he was becoming. While others were still allowed to make mistakes, allowed to experiment, and allowed to fail, Albert gradually felt that every time he stepped onto the field, the eyes of coaches, teammates, and family were waiting for something bigger, and he understood, even though no one said it out loud, that he wasn't allowed to let them down. There was no carefree youth in those years, because every practice wasn't just skill building. It was a reminder that baseball had become the only thread connecting him to a stable future. That if he let go, he could fall back into the swirl of insecurity his family had tried so hard to escape. Albert learned to swallow his emotions very early, not because he didn't know sadness or fear, but because he understood there was no room for those feelings on the path he was walking, that every tear was a sign of weakness, that life had taught him to avoid at all costs. While other kids talked about dreams, Albert talked about responsibility. While they thought of the future as something distant, Albert already carried the expectations of his family, his immigrant community, and himself on his shoulders, and baseball became the unspoken promise that he wouldn't let all those sacrifices be for nothing. Talent, in that context, stopped being a gift and slowly became a gentle curse, because it opened the door forward, but at the same time slammed shut every other path, leaving Albert no chance to try living a different life, no space to ask himself what he really wanted. Only one road he had to walk to the end. Every game, every youth tournament, every bit of praise tightened the cage of expectations around him a little more, and he began to understand that success didn't bring freedom, Like people say, it brought deeper bondage. Because once you proved your worth, you were forced to repeat it over and over. Albert carried responsibility early not because anyone forced him, but because he voluntarily placed it on his own shoulders as a way to control his life, as a way to make sure he would never go back to being the helpless child who once trembled in that old house in the Dominican Republic. He trained with an intensity many called excessive, but for Albert, it wasn't obsession, it was survival. Because if he slowed down, if he relaxed even a little, he feared everything he had built could collapse. In those years, baseball taught Albert how to stand firm, but it also taught him a harsh lesson. His value was tied tightly to performance, and the world's affection for him came with conditions. No one said it out loud, but he felt it in every expectant look, every satisfied nod when he hit well, and every heavy silence when he made a mistake. It was from here that the double life began to take clearer shape, with one Albert on the field growing stronger, more disciplined, and more reliable, while the Albert inside learned to lock away fear, suppress exhaustion, and hide questions that were never allowed to be spoken. Early success gave him no time to slow down and reflect. It swept him into the whirlwind of expectations and responsibility, where every step forward brought heavier pressure. And looking back, people now see that Albert Pujols' talent, the very thing that carried him to legend status, was also the rope that bound him to a journey with no stopping point, where youth was traded for stability and emotions were sacrificed to earn the world's trust. When Albert Pujols stepped into Major League Baseball with the street, Louis Cardinals, his career didn't follow the normal rhythm of a rookie who needs time to adjust, stumble, and grow. It exploded right away, as if destiny had been written long before, because in just his first few seasons, Pujols put up numbers that stunned the entire league, hitting with astonishing consistency, pure power that wasn't wild, game-reading ability like a veteran, and a calmness far beyond his years, so that in a very short time, he was no longer seen as a promising young talent, but as an irreplaceable pillar of the team. Success came too early, too fast, for even Pujols himself to fully grasp what was happening. Because while other players were still allowed to learn through mistakes, he was immediately placed in the role of a carrier, someone who had to deliver wins, someone not allowed to play with an experimental mindset. The media quickly canonized him, calling him the new standard of baseball, the perfect model combining talent, character, and work ethic. And in that spotlight, Pujols was praised as a rare thing in the skeptical era of professional sports, where people desperately wanted a face they could trust completely. But that very early glorification turned the peak into an invisible chain, because from that moment on, every season of Pujols' career stopped being just a year of playing. It became a harsh test of whether he still deserved all that praise. Every bad swing, every short slump, was scrutinized under harsher lights than anyone else's. And Pujols gradually understood that his success didn't allow him to be an ordinary human being, because the world wouldn't accept a forming legend being allowed to miss a beat. In the clubhouse, he was the rock. On the field, he was the hope. In front of the media, he was the image that always had to be flawless, and there was no space for fatigue or personal doubt. It was during this period that Pujols began wearing a necessary mask to survive in the role he had never asked for, a mask of just enough coolness to keep distance, of rigid discipline so no one could see the inner tremors, and of near-perfect moral standards that made him an icon but also separated him from the rest of his humanity. He learned to answer interviews with safe words, learned to walk, behave, and carry himself like a role model, because he understood that one moment of letting go could bring that image crashing down, and with it, the trust of an entire community that had pinned its hopes on him. On the field, Pujols still played with passion and intense focus, but behind it was an ever-growing pressure. As each passing season raised the bar, he had to meet not just from the outside but from himself, because he wouldn't allow himself to fall short of the image the world had built. Small pains started appearing, warning signals from his body slowly showing up. But Pujols chose silence not because he didn't feel them, but because he believed someone in his position had no right to complain, that admitting pain meant admitting limits, and limits were something a legend wasn't allowed to have. He kept stepping onto the field, kept playing at high intensity, kept fulfilling the duties of a star, while inside, exhaustion built up day by day like debt that hadn't yet come due. The coldness others saw wasn't arrogance, it was a protective shell, because if emotions showed, he feared he wouldn't have the strength to keep carrying the weight of expectations, and so Pujols chose to control everything, from his daily rhythm to his expressions, from his training to how he faced pressure. The Cardinals became the place where he built his legacy, but also where he learned the bitter lesson that success didn't bring lasting safety. It only brought harsher and harsher demands, and that with each passing year, he wasn't just facing opponents on the field, but also facing his own past image. When looking back on this period, people usually only see the brilliant numbers and glorious moments, but few realize that it was right there with the Cardinals, where Pujols became a legend, that he also began to lose the right to be weak because success came too early and stole from him the chance to grow naturally, forcing him to carry the role of an icon on his shoulders while his soul still bore the scars of a child who had learned to survive through silence. Family came to Albert Pujols very early, almost in parallel with the moment his career had just begun to blossom. And while many young players were still fumbling around, enjoying freedom, fame, and the feeling of living for themselves, Pujols stepped straight into the role of a husband and a father, with all the seriousness and responsibility he had learned from a childhood full of insecurity. An early marriage for Pujols was not a youthful impulse, but a conscious choice, as if he believed that family would be the anchor holding his life steady amid the whirlwind of fame that was rushing in, a safe place he had lacked so much as a child. But Pujols's family life did not stretch out in that simple peace, because when his daughter was born with Down syndrome, his private world changed instantly, not loudly, not dramatically, but profoundly and irreversibly. From that moment, Pujols was no longer just a baseball star at the peak. He became the absolute emotional and material pillar for a family that needed him in the most total way, where every decision, every move he made was tied to the question of whether it was safe enough, sustainable enough for the people he loved. Family, instead of becoming a place for him to come home and rest after grueling seasons, gradually turned into a space of nonstop responsibility, because the worry for his daughter never stopped when the stadium lights went out, and the long nights after games were no longer time to unwind, but moments of deep concern about the future, about health, about the ability to shield her from a world that was already unfair. Pujols rarely spoke about this in front of the media, because he understood that the image of a strong legend did not allow private worries to surface. But inside, mental exhaustion built up day by day as he had to constantly switch between two opposing roles, a man not allowed to show weakness in public, and a father who needed sensitivity, patience, and unconditional sacrifice. Family no longer became the place where he could unload his burdens, because that very family needed him to stand firmer than ever. And in that bitter paradox, Pujols learned to pour all his remaining energy into those around him, even if it meant neglecting his own emotional needs. He became more closed off, shared less, not because of a lack of love, but because he feared that if his emotions spilled out, he wouldn't have the strength to keep carrying the role life had assigned him. In those years, Pujols lived in a constant state of having to be strong, not just on the field, but inside his own home, where he was the support for his wife, the role model for his children, the man not allowed to waver. And gradually, that very dedication turned into a form of silent sacrifice, as he began to define his own worth entirely through how much he could do for others. Family, over time, became the center of every decision, from signing contracts to choosing teams to how he faced injuries and pain, because he no longer allowed himself to pause or step back, not out of personal ambition, but out of the fear that any weakness on his part could drag instability into the lives of those he loved. In that role, Pujols rarely gave himself permission to feel sad or angry, because he believed negative emotions were a luxury his family could not afford anymore. And so he learned to swallow them, just as he had swallowed the fears of his childhood, to keep the surface of life always stable. The rare moments when he could be alone brought no real relief, because even in silence, his mind kept spinning with responsibilities, with lists of things to do, to protect, to ensure, and gradually, he no longer remembered the last time he truly lived for himself. The emotional tragedy of Pujols did not come from breakdown or betrayal, but from the slow depletion of a man who always put himself last, a man who believed that love meant sacrifice, and that the more he sacrificed, the safer his family would be. When looking back, people easily praise Pujols as an exemplary father, a responsible husband, but few realize that it was precisely in that seemingly noble role that he gradually lost the space to breathe, to be weak, to be himself, and from there, the double life no longer existed, only between the field and behind the scenes. It seeped right into family life, where a strong, calm Albert Pujols was always present, while the tired and fragile person behind him continued to be pushed deeper into silence as he began living for everyone except himself. Albert Pujols's body did not betray him in a dramatic moment or with a fall that would make the whole world stop. It betrayed him in a much quieter and more cruel way, through small, repeating pains, through the heavy feeling every morning upon waking, through warning signals that only he felt but never allowed himself to acknowledge. At first, it was just vague pains in his feet, runs that no longer felt light, training sessions ending with lingering soreness longer than usual, and Pujols, following the habit formed since childhood, chose to ignore it, because, in his mind, pain was an unavoidable part of responsibility, the price to pay for standing firm in the role he had accepted. But time did not stand still, and the body did not forget what had been forced for too long. The pains became persistent. Injuries appeared, then disappeared, then returned, each time a little worse, a little deeper, as if the body was trying to speak while the man kept demanding it stay silent. Pujols entered a familiar but exhausting cycle. Treatment, recovery, back to the field, then pain again, a loop without end, where each return no longer felt like a victory but just the continuation of duty. In those years, he learned to live with chronic pain, learned to distinguish between pain he could endure and pain he needed to hide, because he understood that in his position, resting was not simply a personal choice, but a decision that affected teammates, the team, and those who had placed trust in him. Painkiller injections became a familiar part of playing life, not as abuse, but as a tool to extend his ability to stand on the field one more day, one more game, one more season. And each time the needle touched skin, Pujols did not think of long-term risks, but only of the need to fulfill the role right in front of him. Surgeries happened quietly. No big press conferences, no dramatic announcements, just short absences, then reappearances, because he did not want his story defined by injury, did not want himself to become a symbol of decline when the world was used to seeing him as the standard of durability. The media saw the declining numbers, the slower runs, the hits no longer exploding like before, but few understood that behind it was a prolonged physical battle, where every day of playing was a negotiation with his own body. Pujols stepped onto the field with his familiar calm demeanor, but inside he had to constantly adjust change, how he ran, how he twisted, how he landed to avoid pains that could stop him, and in that process, baseball, which once gave him the feeling of control, gradually became the place exposing the limits of a human being. Each recurring injury did not just wear down the body, but wore down the spirit, because it raised the question he never wanted to face. If one day the body truly refused to obey, what would be left of him when his entire sense of worth had been tied to the ability to stand on the field and complete the task? But Pujols did not allow himself to stop, not just because of ambition or fame, but because of a deeper fear. The fear of letting people down, the fear of becoming a burden, the fear of breaking the image of an always reliable man he had built over so many years. In his mind, physical pain was still easier to bear than having to say sorry for not being able to continue, because apologizing meant admitting he had limits, and admitting limits was something he had learned to avoid since he was very young. Family, team, teammates, fans, all became supports, but also invisible forces keeping him on the field longer than his body allowed. And Pujols accepted it as part of the silent vow he had made to himself, that he would not quit, that he would not leave before he had done everything he could. On the evenings after games, when the pain became more pronounced, he did not complain. He did not seek sympathy, he endured in silence. Because, in his world, enduring had become a measure of character, a way to prove he deserved the role given to him. The body betrayed him piece by piece, joint by joint, muscle by muscle, but his will still held the reins tight, forcing the body to keep going, like a soldier continuing to march, though wounded not because he didn't feel the pain, but because he believed the mission mattered more than personal feeling. And it was in this period that the physical tragedy of Pujols reached its deepest point, not in the specific level of injury, but in the fateful decision he repeated over and over. That pain, no matter how long and persistent, was still easier to bear than letting people down, that it was better to carry unseen wounds than to leave a gap on the field, and that if he had to pay with his own body to keep his responsibility intact, he was ready to accept it. When looking back, people often speak of Albert Pujols' durability as an admirable virtue, but few stop to understand that that durability came at a cost, that it was built from painful mornings, quiet surgeries, painkiller shots, and a will that forced himself to keep going, and that precisely in the moments when his body began to betray him, but he still refused to stop, Pujols' double life was no longer just a story between the public and private. It became a fierce conflict between the man and his own body, a war with no audience, no applause, and no clear victory. Only prolonged endurance until it could endure no more. As Albert Pujols gradually came to be seen not just as an outstanding player, but as a moral icon of Major League Baseball, a rare, clean role model in an era full of skepticism, where baseball was haunted by doping, scandals, and the collapse of trust, it was precisely at that moment that an invisible prison also closed around his inner life. Pujols was not canonized because he sought it out, but because the world needed someone to believe in, needed a face to represent old-fashioned but comforting values: hard work, humility, family, faith, discipline. And when that image was built high enough, it began to carry a weight that crushed the very person standing inside it. From then on, Pujols no longer just played for his team, he played for a moral standard, where every mistake, no matter how small, carried far greater meaning than the scoreboard result. He was not allowed to slump, because slumping meant shaking faith. He was not allowed to show frustration, because frustration shattered the calm image. He was not allowed to be weak, because weakness did not fit the role society had assigned him. That glorification, instead of bringing a sense of security, gradually suffocated his inner space, because Pujols understood that once he became an icon, he no longer had the right to live like an ordinary human being, where emotions could rise and fall, and mistakes could exist. In the clubhouse, he was the exemplary veteran. In front of the media, he was the safe answer. In the eyes of fans, he was a moral anchor. And in all those places, There was no room for the question, "Am I okay?" because his role was to be okay, to be strong, to be in control. The spiritual isolation began with the very admiration itself. The more he was praised, the further he was pushed from the ability to share, because no one knew how to treat an icon except by continuing to pile expectations onto it. The physical pains he carried from season to season were no longer just medical issues. They became psychological burdens, because acknowledging them meant admitting the icon had cracks, and Pujols did not allow himself to become the one who broke the image millions had placed their trust in. He learned to self-censor his emotions, to isolate negative thoughts, to force himself to always remain composed. And in that process, the gap between the real person and the public image grew wider and wider, creating an inner life locked away that very few ever had the chance to touch. No one asked if he was tired, because icons are not allowed to be tired. No one asked if he was in pain, because legends are not allowed to hurt. No one asked if he was okay, because in the public's imagination, he was always okay. And it was that collective silence that forced Pujols to carry everything himself, to dialogue alone with his fears, to endure the pressure alone, to find ways to stand firm when there was no space to collapse. He continued to appear in front of cameras with his familiar calm demeanor, continued to fulfill his duties to the team and family, continued to live up to the image the world expected, while inside, the spiritual loneliness grew deeper, because the more he became an icon, the less he was seen as a human being who needed to be heard. The psychological tragedy of Pujols did not come from a public breakdown, but from the quiet accumulation of pressure, where every passing day was a day he had to remind himself that he was not allowed to err, not allowed to weaken, not allowed to stop, and that his value, in the eyes of the world, was tied to his ability to maintain that perfect image. When the moral icon becomes a prison, Pujols was not imprisoned by others, but by the very expectations he had accepted to carry on his shoulders, expectations that both nurtured his career and quietly eroded his inner life, until in silence, he continued to walk alone, not because he didn't need anyone, but because no one remembered to ask whether the man behind the icon was truly okay. When Albert Pujols signed the contract with the Los Angeles Angels, it was not just an ordinary sports agreement, but a symbolic event, a historic 10-year deal with a figure large enough to make the entire league take notice. And in that moment, the world believed the Angels had just bought a legend still in full value, a winning machine that would bring not only clutch hits, but also credibility, trust, and a new identity to the team. But very few realized that for Pujols, that signature felt more like an inescapable commitment than a promising new chapter. The expectations placed on his shoulders were almost unrealistic, because the Angels weren't just hoping for the stability of a veteran player, they were hoping for a recreation of Pujols at his peak, as if time didn't exist and the human body had no limits. And from the very first day in the new uniform, Pujols felt that pressure seeping into every run, every swing. While the Cardinals had been the place where he grew up alongside expectations that built gradually over the years, the Angels were the place where every expectation was compressed right from the start. No transition period, no patience, only the repeated question, when will he become the Pujols of the past again? But the past cannot be recreated, and his body, already worn down through many seasons of endurance, began to break down faster than he had ever imagined. The chronic pains no longer within control, mornings waking up with heaviness in every joint, runs slowing even as his will pushed him to go faster. On the field, the numbers no longer reflected the legendary image the public expected, and the media, once his glorifiers, began to change their tone from respect to doubt, from anticipation to criticism, as if that contract was proof of an unforgivable mistake. Pujols, once seen as the icon of character and stability, was now viewed as a financial burden, a name taking up a roster spot, a painful reminder of time's cruelty. And in that atmosphere, every game became an unspoken trial, where he was judged by every missed hit and every slowed step. But the most painful thing was not in the articles or the commentary. It was the feeling that he had done everything right throughout his career, yet still couldn't escape the moment when people turned their backs, as if a person's worth could be reduced to a few numbers on a stat sheet. Pujols continued to endure in silence, because admitting his body had reached its limit meant admitting he could no longer meet the expectations written into that contract. And for him, that hurt more than any physical pain. He adjusted his play, accepted a new role, sacrificed his personal image to try contributing in less glamorous ways, but those changes weren't enough to soothe an environment accustomed to seeing him through the lens of past glory. With each passing season, the pressure didn't lessen, it only morphed. From expectation to doubt, from doubt to disappointment. And in that cycle, Pujols still kept the habit of stepping onto the field with calm composure, as if nothing touched him, because he had grown too accustomed to hiding what was shattering inside. Family remained his anchor, but also the reason he wouldn't allow himself to stop, because he didn't want that contract to become a symbol of failure, didn't want the people he loved to see him defined by decline. Treatments continued, painkiller injections continued to extend his playing ability, and each time, Pujols reminded himself that if he could just endure a little more, one more season, one more game, he would fulfill the promise he had signed with his full honor. But that endurance came at a terrible cost, because it forced him to live in constant tension, fighting a body in rebellion, while fighting a public, growing, impatient, and in that two-front war, there was no clear victory, only accumulating exhaustion. The media rarely mentioned the years Pujols had given before, rarely questioned the physical price he had paid, because in the cold logic of professional sports, the present always overpowers the past, and decline, no matter the reason, is still seen as unacceptable. Pujols understood that better than anyone, but understanding didn't make it hurt less, because deep down, he was still the boy who once believed that if he was strong enough and did his duty, he would be accepted. The Angels became the tragic climax of the double life, where Pujols not only had to carry the weight of a historic contract, but also had to face the harsh truth that even heroes can one day be seen as burdens, and in that context, he still chose the familiar path: silence, endurance, continuing to step onto the field, because for him, quitting midway would be the greatest betrayal of the person he had tried to become his entire life. As he entered this phase of his life, Albert Pujols was no longer simply living in two different spaces, but trapped between two irreconcilable lives, where the field and the backstage existed side by side, yet never touched each other. On the field, he was still introduced with the familiar grand titles: living legend, symbol of discipline and endurance, a name that commanded respect from the stands, even when the numbers were no longer as brilliant as before. And every time Pujols stepped out of the dugout, people still saw the image of a man who had once dominated an entire era, a legacy that time had not yet erased. But when the clubhouse door closed, when the stadium lights went out, another life began to reveal itself, not loud, not with an audience, just prolonged physical pain, accumulated mental exhaustion, and a heavy silence he had grown accustomed to carrying like part of himself. The backstage had no applause, no stat sheet to shield him, only a body demanding rest and a mind forced to ignore that call in order to keep fulfilling the role. Pujols lived in a constant state of switching, from an icon celebrated in front of tens of thousands of fans to a man who had to sit quietly with ice packs, medication, and long rehabilitation sessions, and it was that very contrast that made the gap between the two lives grow deeper, as if every step he took forward on the field pulled him further away from the possibility of living truthfully with what he was enduring. Family, which had once been his anchor, began to clearly feel that distance not because of a lack of love, but because Pujols was carrying more burdens than he could ever share. He was physically present, but his mind often stayed on the field, with the numbers, the expectations, the criticism, the unfinished responsibilities, and inside the family space, that silence became more obvious than ever. Conversations grew shorter, pauses stretched longer, not because of explosive conflicts, but because neither side knew where to begin. When the man in front of them was still the reliable pillar, yet seemed increasingly detached from his own emotions. Pujols did not intentionally create distance. He simply did not know how to stop, because throughout his entire life, stopping had meant failure, surrender, letting everyone down, and that belief had taken root so deeply that he no longer had the ability to recognize when his body and spirit had gone beyond their limits. The two lives collided in small but painful moments. When he came home after a bad game, carrying exhaustion he could not put into words. When the worried looks from loved ones reflected a concern he did not know how to ease. And when he realized that despite doing everything to protect his family from instability, his very silence and endurance had unintentionally created an emotional void that was hard to fill. On the field, Pujols still maintained his calm image, still answered interviews with safe phrases, still walked with the posture of a man accustomed to pressure, but backstage was where he had to face the question he was never allowed to ask out loud. How much longer can I keep enduring this? No one in that world truly wanted to hear the answer, because the answer would force them to see something uncomfortable, that legends get tired too, that they hurt, that they have limits, and Pujols understood that staying silent was easier for everyone, even if the price was ever-deepening loneliness. In those days, he lived like a man walking on two parallel roads, one paved with the red carpet of respect and fame, the other rough with pain and depletion, and there was no intersection where those two roads could ever meet. Every time he tried to bring his real self into the light, the fear of breaking the image pulled him back, and every time he tried to fully dissolve into the role of legend, his body and spirit reminded him that the cost was becoming too high. Family could feel him drifting away, not because of a lack of responsibility, but because responsibility had completely consumed the man, and in that atmosphere, Pujols gradually became someone who lived for the role more than for his emotions, someone who did not know where to stop, because he had never been taught that he had the right to stop. Those two lives, instead of supporting each other, began to cancel each other out. The tension from the field followed him home, and family worries followed him onto the field, creating an exhausting loop with no escape. The peak of the double life was not in one explosive moment, but in a prolonged weariness to the point where he could no longer clearly distinguish where his real self ended and the image he had to maintain began, and in that blur, Pujols kept walking not because he did not feel the pain, but because he had never learned how to do the opposite. Albert Pujols's marriage did not collapse with loud arguments or dramatic moments that made outsiders turn their heads. It fell apart much more quietly, like a house rotting from the inside, when everyone had run out of strength to keep holding it up. For many years, their life ran on discipline and duty, on game schedules, treatment schedules, children's school schedules, on tired evenings that ended in silence rather than conversation, and that very silence, initially seen as a way to preserve peace, gradually became a void that could not be filled. There was no betrayal to blame, no moral failing to condemn, just two people who had spent so much energy carrying responsibilities that they no longer had enough left to nurture their own emotions. Pujols entered marriage believing that family was the absolute safe place where he could stand firm against the world. But over time, family became yet another space where he had to keep being strong, keep controlling, keep hiding, because he did not allow himself to bring weakness from the field home. The woman beside him never lacked love or patience, but the presence of a man who always carried pressure, who was always on alert and exhausted, gradually created an invisible distance, where they were still together physically, but growing further apart emotionally. Conversations revolved around work, children, obligations, replacing private sharing. And over time, intimacy was worn away by the habit of silence, by the feeling that any problem spoken aloud would just become one more burden. Pujols did not know how to pause to listen to himself, and therefore did not know how to fully open up to his life partner, not because of a lack of love, but because he believed his role was to carry, to protect, to remain stable, even when that meant suppressing his deepest emotional needs. A failing body, a weary spirit, public pressure, and family responsibility all piled on top of each other, turning every day into survival rather than living. And in that rhythm, the marriage gradually lost its ability to recover, not because of one specific event, but because of the accumulation of prolonged depletion. Any attempts at repair, if they existed, happened in silence, because both had grown more used to enduring than confronting, and when endurance became the main way to exist, the emotional distance grew so large that there was no way back to the starting point. Pujols continued to appear in public, with the familiar image of an exemplary man, while his marriage quietly cracked, as painful proof that even choices made with good intentions and responsibility can lead to sad endings when a person no longer has the strength to take care of himself. That dissolution carried no resentment, only a quiet sense of failure, because Pujols, who had always believed he could control life through discipline and effort, had to face a hard truth. Some things cannot be saved just by trying harder. When the marriage ended, it left no loud cracks, only a silent void where both realized they had walked together to the absolute limit of endurance, and that continuing would only prolong the pain. For Pujols, this event was not just the end of a relationship, but the collapse of a deep belief that if he was strong enough and responsible enough, everything would be okay, and that very collapse made his double life clearer than ever. As the man admired out there had to quietly accept that even in his private life, where it was supposed to be a refuge, he too had reached his limit. After the marriage ended in silence, Albert Pujols entered an even more cruel phase, because this was when he began to realize that not only had his private life fallen apart, but the central role that had defined him for decades was also slipping away. Baseball, which had once been the absolute order of his life, which had once given him position, meaning, and reason to endure, no longer needed him in the old way, and that change did not come with a decisive announcement, but through small, undeniable signs: fewer opportunities to play, a reduced role, strategy meetings no longer revolving around his name, and the emergence of younger, healthier faces carrying greater expectations. Pujols was not pushed out with disrespect, but by the cold logic of time, where every legend eventually has to step aside, and that very natural transition brought a profound sense of loss, because throughout his life he had tied his self-worth tightly to his ability to contribute on the field. When he was no longer the center, Pujols had to face a void that was hard to name, a feeling as if the familiar ground beneath his feet was slowly disappearing, exposing the fragility he had tried so long to hide. Being replaced is nothing new in sports, but for someone who had lived too long in an indispensable role, it was a blow to identity, because it raised a question he had never prepared to answer. If not baseball, then who am I? That question did not appear in interviews or headlines, but echoed in the most ordinary moments when he sat alone after practice, when the game schedule thinned out, when mornings were no longer completely dictated by the rhythm of the season, and in those silences, he realized that for many years he had postponed building an identity beyond the field. Pujols had once believed baseball would always be there, or at least stay long enough that he would never have to face this emptiness. But time waits for no one, and as it moved forward, It carried the truth that even icons have an expiration date. He tried to adapt, accepted the new role, did everything asked with his familiar professionalism, but inside, the loss still smoldered, because acceptance did not mean the absence of pain, and understanding the reason did not dull the ache. Those around him saw a calm Pujols, ready to help, ready to bridge to the next generation. But few realized that every mature action came with him having to surrender another piece of the person he once was. When the legend was no longer needed, the silence grew thicker, because there were no more lights to obscure the inner questions, and Pujols was forced to confront a terrifying reality. He had spent his entire life becoming a great baseball player, but he had never learned how to exist when that title was no longer called. This loss of role did not just affect his career, it spread to his spiritual life, as he began to feel himself drifting, not because of a lack of goals, but because the single goal that had once shaped every decision was slowly moving away. In those moments, Pujols understood that the greatest pain was not in being replaced, but in realizing he had gone too long without allowing himself to be anything other than a ball player, and when that role no longer occupied the center, he had to face himself without the protective armor of achievements and fame. This was the phase when the double life began to collapse in a different way, not because the two lives collided, but because one of them was fading away, leaving the real person standing alone before an unanswered question. A question with no quick answer and no easy comfort. If baseball was no longer the center, where would the man named Albert Pujols find meaning? And did he have the courage to keep walking without the familiar map that had guided him his entire life? Albert Pujols's divorce happened at the moment when any human being needs an anchor the most. But for him, it was the time he was forced to step onto the field to complete his final season in the role he had tied his whole life to, and those two losses, his private life dissolving and his career reaching its end, did not appear one after the other, but ran parallel, piling on each other like two undercurrents, pulling him down in silence. The divorce had no press conference, no public blame, no details for the media to exploit, just a brief announcement and a quiet shift in private life, where shared habits vanished, familiar spaces grew colder, and a man accustomed to living for duty had to learn to face a sense of failure he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. But even as his personal life was crumbling, Pujols kept playing, kept stepping onto the field with calm composure, kept answering interviews with safe words, because he believed his role was to hold the image to the very end, to not let private pain shatter the order everyone was used to seeing. On the field, fans still saw a legend taking his final steps, a respected name, a symbol of endurance, but behind the closed door, no one witnessed the long, sleepless nights, the moments he sat alone with questions about what had been lost and what could never be reclaimed. Those two parallel losses created a crushing mental pressure, because every time he tried to cling to baseball to avoid thinking about his broken family, the reality that his career was also sliding toward its end pulled him back into emptiness, and conversely, every time he faced loneliness in his private life, he had to force himself to focus on the season as if it were the last life raft keeping him afloat. Pujols maintained his familiar discipline, kept training, kept playing with the professionalism he had upheld for so many years, but inside his mental energy drained faster than ever, because there was no longer any place for him to truly rest, no space where he could be weak without fearing he would disappoint someone. Those around him saw that calm and mistook it for easy acceptance, for strength to move through. But the truth was, he was bracing himself to keep from collapsing right in front of the world, because if he stopped, if he let the pain show, both pillars that had held up his life would vanish at once. The final season, instead of being a prepared farewell filled with pride, became a journey of endurance, where every game was a reminder to himself that if he could just finish this stretch, just complete the role, he would have time to face what was breaking apart. But that time did not come as quickly as he hoped, And with each passing day the sense of collapse was compressed a little more, like a dam cracking that he kept patching to keep the surface from bursting. No one knew that behind the polite smiles and thanks to the fans was a man slowly losing his anchors, saying goodbye at the same time to the two most important parts of his life, and doing the only thing he knew how to do: keep walking. The double tragedy of this phase was not in the divorce or the season ending, but in both happening simultaneously, forcing Pujols to face the truth that even endurance has limits and that some pains cannot be overcome with discipline or willpower. He held the image to the very end, not out of pride, but because it was the only language he knew to communicate with the world. And while everyone saw a legend completing his final journey, no one realized that behind that uniform was a man collapsing in silence, trying to hold everything together just a little longer. One more game, before facing the void that baseball and family had once filled. Albert Pujols' return to the street. Louis Cardinals did not unfold like a glorious homecoming, did not carry the look of a legend coming back to reclaim the spotlight, but resembled a circle closing in pain and silence, where a man returned to the starting point not to find miracles, but to fulfill the final duty to his own life. When he put on that familiar uniform again, Pujols brought no expectations of a last championship, made no promises of glorious moments like in the beginning, because he understood better than anyone that time had taken what it wanted to take, and the only thing left was the responsibility to walk the chosen path to its very end. In the stands, fans saw an icon coming home. Applause rang out, not for numbers waiting ahead, but for memories of a bygone era. And in that moment, Pujols felt the familiar warmth, but also the weight of reality that this was not a rebirth, but a farewell written in acceptance. He stepped onto the field with a calmness that had become instinct, playing not to prove anything anymore, but to complete an unspoken promise to himself and to the team that had given him his first chance that he would not leave this journey unfinished. No miracles happened, no explosive turnaround erased every limit, only ordinary moments carried out, with maximum dedication, as if every time he stepped onto the field was a quiet goodbye to the past. His body still carried the old wounds, every movement weighed and considered, every decision accompanied by self-awareness of limits. And in that context, baseball was no longer a battle for victory, but a closing ritual, where he allowed himself to be fully present without embellishment. Younger teammates looked at him with respect, not for what he could still do, but for how he faced what he could no longer do. And that very composure created a different kind of power, quiet but profound. Returning to the Cardinals, Pujols sought neither redemption nor validation, because he was too tired of having to prove, and instead he chose honesty with himself, accepting that this circle closed not in blinding light, but in the understanding that every journey has an end. The games passed without promises of a final win, but they carried a sense of completion, as if each day was a step closer to the peace he had never had time to seek. Fans might call it a beautiful ending, but for Pujols, it was a necessary ending, where he no longer ran from the truth that he had reached his limit, and no longer tried to cling to the image of an immortal legend. He played with the focus of a man who knew these were the final moments, and each one carried the meaning of a thank you to the team, to the fans, and to himself for having come this far. The circle closed not with victorious cheers, but with respectful silence, where everyone understood that not every story needs a climax to be complete, and that sometimes fulfilling duty is the highest form of honor. For Pujols, returning to the Cardinals was not about rewriting history, but about placing the final period in the right place. No avoidance, no embellishment, just a man standing straight, looking back at the road he had traveled, and stepping off the field with the acceptance that this was the time to let go, not in failure, but in the rare honesty of a life lived fully in its role to the very end. After leaving the field, Albert Pujols entered a phase with no game schedule to shield him, no roar of the crowd to soften what remained. And it was in that stillness that the aftershocks of a lifetime of endurance revealed themselves most clearly. His body carried the permanent marks of years spent forcing himself forward. Joints stiff every morning, lingering pains that appeared without reason, new limits, forcing him to relearn everyday living, as if every movement was a reminder that the price of endurance had been paid in full, and there was no way to reverse it. Without the pressure to perform, but also without the role's armor to wear, Pujols faced a far harder reality, living with what cannot be healed, not as a loud tragedy, but as a new condition of existence. Family had changed, no longer the old structure, no longer life revolving around the season, and in that space, he had to learn to be present without playing the hero, to listen instead of carry, to accept that some relationships had reached their limit and could not return to how they were. Moments with his children became slower, simpler, no longer chopped up by packed schedules, but they also carried a sense of lateness, as if he was trying to make up for years that had passed too quickly. Pujols did not seek complete healing, because he understood that some wounds do not exist to be erased, but to be carried, as proof of a life lived fully, and that very understanding helped him move past the temptation to prove anything more after his career ended. With no goals left to conquer, no records left to chase, he faced the emptiness with cautious acceptance, one small step at a time, because his whole life had been programmed to move forward, not to stop. The days without baseball forced him to confront himself, to question value not tied to performance, and the answer, if it came, arrived slowly and incompletely, because it was not a grand discovery, but a series of small adjustments in how he viewed life. Pujols began to understand that peace is not a state without pain, but the ability to live with pain without letting it define his entire being. He accepted that he would never be the person he once was, that his body would never be okay in the old sense, that some emotional voids would not be filled, and instead of fighting it, he chose to exist in the new reality with rare honesty. With no field left to fulfill duty, his duty now was to himself, a task far harder than any season, because it required him to shed habits that had once saved him but no longer fit the present. The tragedy's aftershocks were not in the absence of glory, but in learning to live when glory was no longer the compass. And in that journey, Pujols did not find complete healing, only enough acceptance to continue, enough to not turn away from what had happened. He lived slower, listened more, and allowed himself to exist without needing to prove, without bracing, without being an icon for anyone, and it was in that simplicity that he began to build a different kind of peace, fragile but real, where pain did not disappear, but also no longer ruled. Living with what cannot be healed is not failure, but the final step of a life that went too far on willpower alone. And now, Pujols accepted setting that willpower down, not to give up, but to stay with life in a less harsh way, where each passing day was no longer measured by achievements, but by the ability to be fully present with what remained. And when all the noisy chapters had finally closed, when the baseball field was only a memory, and the name Albert Pujols was no longer called out every night amid cheers, his story ended not with redemption, not with a miracle, and not with the complete happiness people usually expect from legends. It ended in silence, where a man stopped, looked straight at his own life, no embellishment, no avoidance, and accepted that the price he had paid was real, was enough, and could never be repaid. Pujols was not granted spiritual reward at the end of the road, no moment of enlightenment that made all the pain meaningful, no promise that all the losses would eventually be compensated. Instead, what remained was the character he had preserved his entire life, the responsibility he had never refused, and the shape of an American man who had lived true to the role he chose, even as that role wore him down day by day. He had lived like a pillar not allowed to lean, an icon not allowed to crack, a father, husband, teammate who always placed duty before emotion, and that very choice had shaped his entire journey, from dazzling glory to the silent years of depletion. No one could say he was wrong, because he always did what was considered right. But no one could deny that those right things had taken away so much that he would never have the chance to reclaim. Pujols was not completely healed, because some wounds are created from endurance stretched too long, and time only quiets them rather than erases them. His body carried the marks of those enduring years, his private life bore the traces of disproportionate sacrifices, and his mind carried the memory of a man who had grown so accustomed to living for others that he forgot how to live for himself. But it was precisely in that incompleteness that his true value shone clearer than ever. Pujols was not a legend because he was undefeated, but because he did not run when things became difficult. Not because he always won, but because he did not betray what he believed was his duty. Not because he was perfect, but because he accepted paying the price for his choices without demanding the world's sympathy. In an era where people easily withdraw when the cost becomes too high, Pujols stood as proof of a different kind of man. The kind who believes honor lies not in the final result, but in walking the chosen path to its very end. His story does not comfort, because it does not promise that living right will bring happiness. But it is honest, because it shows that living right sometimes means accepting loss without resentment. He was not redeemed from life's distortions, was not allowed to go back and fix things, only allowed to keep living with what remained. And that very continuation, quiet and enduring, was the deepest tribute. When looking back at Albert Pujols, what lingers is not the home runs or the titles etched in gold, but the image of a man who carried too many expectations on his shoulders and still chose not to let go. A man who sacrificed personal lightness to hold order for those around him. He did not defeat time, did not defeat pain, did not defeat breakdown, but he also did not surrender to them. And in the real world, where there are no perfect scripts, that was already a rare form of victory. The absolute tragic ending of this story is not in the collapse, but in the truth that after everything, no deserved reward waited. Only a man standing still, tired but upright, understanding that he had paid enough for the life he had lived. And perhaps in that silence, no further explanation was needed, because sometimes the greatest honor for a human being is not prolonged applause, but the acknowledgement that he lived right, endured enough, and did not turn his back on himself, even when the price of that was never being completely happy. The story of Albert Pujols leaves a quiet but deep sadness, because this is not the tragedy of a man who fell because of mistakes, but the tragedy of a man who lived too right, too long, and too fully with his own sense of responsibility. Across 15 parts, we clearly see how the poor childhood in the Dominican Republic, the alcoholic and violent father, and the fearful journey of immigration to America shaped in Pujols a dangerous belief. Only by being absolutely strong would he deserve to exist. That belief followed him throughout his career, from the dazzling early years with the Cardinals to the historic contract with the Angels, where success turned into a sentence as his body broke down, but he refused to stop. Details like playing through chronic pain, painkiller injections, quiet surgeries, or maintaining a perfect image, even as his marriage cracked and family drifted further away, show the terrifying cost of becoming a moral icon not allowed to show weakness. The most heartbreaking moment is when Pujols faced the question, "If there is no more baseball, who am I?" Because that was when a man realized he had sacrificed his personal identity to fulfill the role society expected. The lesson this story sends to the American people is not to advise us to try less or take less responsibility, but a warning that a society that glorifies endurance to the point of not allowing people to stop is the very society that creates silent tragedies. Success, if not accompanied by space to be weak, to be heard, and to heal becomes a burden rather than a reward. Albert Pujols is honored not because he had a happy ending, but because he lived true to what he believed, paid the full price for that choice, and that painful honesty is what makes his story a profound mirror for modern American life. If the story of Albert Pujols has left you silent before the price of living too right and too enduringly, please hit subscribe to continue joining us on these honest and aching journeys like this one. Thank you for listening all the way to the final minute, and see you again in the next video where we will continue looking straight at the great but never easy fates of American lives.